No? If people want to sign in, there's a sign-in sheet so that you can get more information. I need to find the pen. Thank you. We'll get started in a couple seconds, but there is a sign-in sheet if you want to be kept on a list to make more information. I put a sign-in sheet up at the right behind right in front of Councillor Sweeney. I can't even think of the word right now. Podium. So please do sign in. It's helpful for us just to keep track of who's here as well. You won't get put on any list other than if you want more information, just check that you want us to contact you. Thank you.
You need a pen? You all set?
I got one, thanks.
Can you hear me? Okay. That worked.
Ooh, the din just dropped.
I almost said good morning. It's been a long day. Good afternoon, good evening, I guess, everybody. I'm going to try and stand close to this. I may sit for a little bit, but thank you all for coming to this informal public meeting about design standards. A couple things to clarify. It is not a city council hearing. It is not a city council meeting. We have not submitted anything to city council. So this is really intended to be an opportunity to get feedback, and input, share kind of the process that we went through last year to create these design standards. And let's see. So the agenda, talk a little bit about the background and the purpose. I'm going to break it up into two segments. So the first is a presentation on the concept of tiers and forms, and then the mapping. We'll have some time for discussion on that. Then we're going to ask everyone to kind of break out and move around. We've got some boards and some pins, and you can correlate your tier, your suggestions for what tier goes in what district. And then we'll come back and I can get into kind of more technical part of the design standards, I would say. And then additional Q&A, and then wrap up. I'm hoping not to keep you here all night. So I just wanted to clarify this, why we're here. The design standards project was one of the significant priorities that came out of the 2020 master plan. It is what to some, essentially it's kind of a form-based approach at zoning. So it sets forth a framework for what the buildings look like. Well, for the buildings, for what a building, back up, for the form of a building, and then also how they're placed and sit on a lot. So, and kind of some of the dimensional elements that inform that. It provides clarity for the community and the property owners, uses visuals and graphics to help explain zoning, which a lot of people have a hard time understanding. It's created right now for the walkable mixed-use districts in mind. And so therefore, right now we're thinking it applies to the CC, the newly created CC2, and the CN districts. Those are the only districts that are included. There's one little area of RMD that was shown on the map, which may or may not remain included. There was an older map that was online in an older presentation that showed the BHD, the Beverly Harbor District. That was not intended to be included. It also doesn't include the strip of CN at this time that is Fish Flake Hill. We could discuss that, but right now, that area of, pointing over here, because a lot of you are over here, is not included in this. It can be, that's up for discussion, but, so the design, and there will be time for comments after. The design standards project is not changing the building height or development capacity of any of the existing zones. So it did contemplate changing the height on Cabot Street, but we already did that. So basically, the building heights are anticipated, in our mind and how we worked through it with the steering committee, was that we were thinking about creating these design standards, which are these forms to help people understand what a building should look like and how it should sit on a lot in the existing zoning districts. It's not designed to significantly or at all increase development capacity. On the other hand, not to decrease development capacity. It's not a tool for historic preservation. It is not a tool to create specific standards just for Cabot Street. It's not subjective. It's meant to be objective and really concrete. It does not include the Bass River rezoning. The mayor has put that on hold. And as I said, it doesn't include the Beverly Harbor District because we completed a rezoning for that area in 2014-15. So again, reiterating, this project is basically an easy way to think about it is to take our dimensional standards that are in our zoning and in the CC district and the CN district. They're very complicated. There's a lot of if this, then that, and they rely on neighboring districts. So it's hoping to provide more clarity for both people who own property and people who come and review projects or community members who want to understand what projects are being proposed or what can be done on a site. So just really providing that clarity in a more concrete way. So how we got here, we did this 9-month project from about January to August of last year, led by a consultant, UTL Inc., who also prepared our community master plan that was approved by the planning board in late 2020. We had a steering committee. I'd just like to note some of those members are here tonight. Councilor Rand, Councilor Rotundo, Denny Witten, not here, I don't see him. John Roulette is here, he's actually, since then, is now the chair of our design review board. Rachel Poor, Stefano Basso, did I see him? He's here. Irina Keefe, who's our sustainability director, and Chelsea Zakis, who is our associate planner, also no longer with the city. I kind of want to go back for Bill because I know Bill's really interested in this. Bill, Mr. Finch, Mr. Finch, you missed a really important part for you that I really wanted you to know, that the Beverly Harbor District is not included in this design standards.
Say that again?
The Beverly Harbor District is not intended to be included in this. You were looking at the wrong map. You're welcome to leave. But I hope you stay. So to clarify, I did hear, because this doesn't replace the existing standards if a district already exists. This tool is actually something we're starting with the CC and CN district because there are mixed-use walkable districts. They are the ones that have the kind of more nebulous zoning dimensional requirements right now. It is a tool that we could, in the future, apply to other districts. So we can take this tier concept and decide, maybe we want to consider doing this in another district because it's easier to understand. But we wanted to test it out in the CC and the CN districts first.
Can you tell us what those districts are for us?
We'll get there. Yeah. All right, so primer for people. Again, I work with zoning every day. A lot of you do not. Zoning ordinance is a municipal law. It sets the permitted uses in a zoning district, and it defines the dimensional rules of the lot and the building in those districts, and other requirements such as parking and landscaping requirements, what you have to supply to the planning board for review, what triggers review, what doesn't. Of note, in zoning, we cannot require or say anything about materials or colors, or anything else that is governed by the building code. So design standards and design guidelines, I think there's been some confusion. Standards are essentially what can be in the zoning ordinance. Guidelines would be in addition. So we're talking today about standards, basically taking the dimensional requirements in the zoning ordinance today and replacing them with a new set of dimensional requirements. And these standards, we think, are better because they're, as I said, they're graphic, they relate to what exists in the city today, and they talk about some additional areas too. So buildings and their form, how they're placed on a lot, how parking should interface with the lot, what landscaping minimum requirements should be necessary without getting into too much detail. They need to be specific and predictive so people understand what you're asking for and what you're looking for. So therefore, they're also a little bit less flexible. And then, as I said before, we use visuals and graphics to explain those concepts. Design guidelines, which we formerly had in the tall building overlay district and recently got rid of, are more subjective and instructive. They're kind of a choice of options. We'd like you to do this, but we can't require you to do this. And so it's another step, right? But it does allow for a lot more flexibility. And so right now we're talking about design standards and how they will fit into the zoning ordinance. I will leave time for, there will be a break for questions. Hi, Mayor. I guess I should call out to all the other city councilors who are here formally. Thank you to Councilor St. Hilaire, Councilor Bowen, Council President Flowers, Councilor Rand, I already called you out, Councilor Sweeney, Councilor Crowley. Anybody else? Oh, Councilor Houseman, you're hiding.
If I could, I just want to say hi to everybody. I have to go into my office in about 20 minutes for a school committee meeting. Sorry for the mask, I got sick last night, so anyway, I'm doing that meeting, but I'll listen until then. As Ms. Wynn has and will tell you, this has been a really great process with a lot of input to date, and this point of tonight is to really get a lot of feedback and input. I will just say that the idea of design standards versus guidelines is one that we've been talking about for several years. Our master plan consultants advised us to go with with standards. And I attended about 3.5 years ago a Mayor's Institute on City Design. It's a program put on by the U.S. Conference of Mayors where 8 mayors get together with 8 architectural design experts from around the country and have an intense 2-day program of learning about it. When those 8 architectural design experts, like our master planning consultant, but from other parts of the country, looked at what we have, they all said we need standards. So it's really kind of pushed us in this direction for a while. Sorry.
Well, that's fine, thank you. So as I mentioned before, we're going to talk a little bit first about the tiers in a part 1. We'll have some time for questions about that piece. Break out, do the little pin push exercise, get people moving, and you can feel free to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll come back. And so when we sat down with the steering committee, and actually our consultant suggested this idea of really thinking about stories and a way to easily, number of stories, building stories, and a way to easily think about it. So they created these tiers, and every tier is aligned with a story. So tier 5 is 5 stories, tier 4 is 4 stories, tier 3 is 3 stories, tier 2 is 2 stories, and we don't have any tier 1s. That would fall under a tier 2 as well. And so we really thought about it that way. That's the maximum number of stories. We've played around with height. We've made some changes to height in the zoning ordinance since then. So the height piece of it still needs to be tweaked, right? I think that's what we've heard for sure. And we recognize that, but I want to get together with the steering committee to kind of finalize that. But as I said before, we were not contemplating taller buildings than already allowed in the zoning districts that we're talking about. So the key factors of these tiers is you have number of stories, you have a maximum floor plate, which is the area of that the building takes up on the lot. And then within that, we get into a lot more specificity, but that kind of sets the density and the scale for these buildings. A tier 5, we're thinking downtown, that's the highest building. It addresses the needs of residents and employees from the immediate neighborhood, and it provides goods and services to the larger Beverly community and visitors from the broader region. So that's actually tier 5, 5 stories, tier 4, 4 stories. Tier 3 correlates to our neighborhood center districts, which are smaller districts scattered throughout the community. They allow a mix of uses today with a more neighborhood-focused retail or commercial use, plus residential. And so those districts are really to address the needs of residents and employees from the immediate neighborhood. So we have blown up pieces of the maps around here too, but this is just a general idea of the map that if you've looked, you saw this online, although I've taken out the Bass River, and the final map that we had online did not show the Beverly Harbor District. So this is the final one, and just an idea of what we were thinking with the steering committee in terms of what tiers and where they would be located. I did change it tier 3, 4 because the right side, Cabot Street, which is where it says tier 3, 4, some of those we recently changed to 45 feet, but kept some at 35 feet where they abut residential districts. Low density residential. And a little bit that still exists on the Rantoul Street where it's tier 5, but we would still maintain that standard where 35 feet where you abut or are adjacent to a lower density residential district, which we call R6. So let's see. And then this is an example. So this is the standards that set the lot and what the lot looks like and where the building is placed on the lot. So you may be familiar with terms like setbacks. So how far can the building be from the front of the lot, from the side of the lot, from the rear lot? We now have minimums and maximums. So that allows some flexibility for a building to be located depending on what other features of the site might exist. It's important to have both. We don't want people building right to the lot line of the entire lot, but we also, in a downtown district particularly, we want to make sure that the setback is not too big, because that's better for the pedestrian environment to have buildings that are close to the street. The lot standards also include parking placement, so where the parking lot and any parked car can be also has a setback. We introduced the concept of primary street and secondary street, and we'll show that later, or I will, it's just me. And then minimum open space. So not all of our districts currently have a minimum open space requirement, so this is new in some districts. And it also will help control the amount and limit the amount of building that can take up a lot and provide a little bit of break. And that is kind of what a lot of these standards do, is create breaks, create variations in the building, but also respect that, particularly in the downtown where it's a walkable district, having buildings that are close to the street is important. Oops, I skipped ahead. So, and then the other piece of it is the building standards. So that was the lot, where does the building sit on the lot? The building standards are what does the building look like? Generally, what is the form? We're not getting into materials or colors or styles, but it is what is the form of the building, plus some additional, which I'll talk about in the second portion, is just activation of the ground floor, articulation, how much window frontage, how much facade or window coverage you should have in order to create that environment that is really friendly for people who are walking. And as you'll see here, there's a lot about height, and I mentioned, I kind of blacked it out because I think we need to go back and look at that. And we previously had in the tier 5, up to 65 feet. We do not have that in any of our zoning now, so before I just brought it down, because we have the minimum maximum, I wanted to have a conversation with our consultant and our steering committee before we officially make those changes. And so with our consultant team and the steering committee, what they did was they took these tiers and they went through and analyzed them again. Most of these are Beverly buildings. A couple of them are not. I have them all, if you want to see later, I have all these slides individually and kind of analyzed how each of these buildings would or would not meet these new design standards. And most of them meet them in most ways, but there's one or two things where they don't. I would give, let's see, do I have it in here? Yeah, so the first one on tier 4 is Burnham. That building, too long, wouldn't be allowed to be built. Not enough window coverage, or fenestration is the word we use, I think is another element of that wouldn't be allowed. And so in some of those, it's those little things that wouldn't fit, but some of them it's other, they're close or they're not. As I said, if somebody's really interested in this, I have each of these broken down by each building, but it's a little bit too much detail to go into all of those here. But we can do that at another time, or I can share it with you. So at that point, I wanted to take a break to hear some questions, initial questions about the idea of the tiers and the forms and what I've talked about. This is a repeat slide. We're going to do I'll take some questions first before we do it, and then we'll do the kind of exercise where blue pins are tier 5, red pins are tier 4, yellow pins are tier 3, and white pins are tier 2. And so we'll be around to kind of help you with those boards and districts and explain where they are. You can go and put your pins where you think you'd like to see. And you don't have to do it. You can also talk amongst yourselves, ask me, but first let's see if there's any questions that we want to ask at this point. We'd like to say if everyone can limit it to 3 minutes. Questions, discussion points, just comments you want to make. I'll ask you to use the podium. And I will also point out there is a box up there with index cards. If you don't feel comfortable speaking in public or making your comment in public, you can write your comment on an index card and put it back in the box, and we'll read it. And you also don't have to put your name on it if you don't want to. So at this point, does anybody have any questions or comments they want to make? Go ahead. If you could just go to the podium, though, because we need it this is being broadcast on BevCam, so.
Hi. I'm just wondering, where does the topic of exterior lighting fit into this?
That is not a zoning topic. So lighting, we have, did we do a lighting ordinance? I'm trying to remember. That's typically reviewed during the planning board process. If there's a site plan review, we will review lighting, but there's no requirement for certain lighting standards.
So it's per project?
Yes.
So are there any codes for exterior lighting?
There are. They would fall under the building department, though.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of, and I think we've talked about a dark skies ordinance, which is a separate layer, but it's something that all lighting has to face downward, certain level of lumens, which is the lighting measure. That would be something else that we would do, that the city could do in addition to what we have.
Because it's just, it's lighting is for safety and inviting people into but people are also sleeping. And there's lights on the outsides of buildings that are on all night long. So I'm wondering if that could be addressed somehow.
I know most of the new projects that come through have downcast lighting or shielded lighting that keeps it from coming down. But
it still projects
it's a balance
out.
between what you have to do for safety, like you said, and what, and you know, what you're doing to protect the neighbor's experience, and keep the light from causing additional light pollution. But you're right, it does add, no matter what, you have more lighting.
So it's a per project and also code.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, as an individual member of the Historic District Commission, of course, I'm sorry to see that there is absolutely no room, no reference at all to historic preservation. And since these tiers, these areas fall into some areas where there are some important buildings, doesn't it make sense to at least acknowledge their presence and some sort of reference eventually, since we're talking about design, to allow for some reference, some sense of context?
What are you what are you thinking about? Because this is the zoning ordinance, so it's not really a tool for historic preservation. There could be separate tools that we look at for historic preservation, or maintenance.
I mean, there's
of
one
buildings.
reference to it on page 31, talks about setbacks of a historic building. But I think if this is the city's idea of design and there being standards, I'm not sure why it doesn't make sense in a historic city to include some deference to what makes our city kind of unique. And we're not talking about not having new construction. It's just where it is, what it's next to, and should that not have some significance to the planners?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really about dimensional standards, and this is not the place for that. But when we talk about design, it's design of a building, not kind of more fluid design that is getting into more specifics like colors and materials, and whether a building is built to look historic or to look like a next door building. It's about the form and the shape and the articulation.
Right, but I wasn't even talking about those elements, which obviously are very much a part of historic preservation. I'm simply talking about where, we're talking about new construction, where it is, and so seems to me the dimensions of it should have something to do with context. So if we're not talking about it in design standards, where would we talk about it?
So we did look at, sorry, if we can not have side conversations, it get really difficult to hear. We did look at existing buildings and the context of the existing buildings when we set these standards. So they're honoring kind of the articulation, where the first floors are, where the building heights are, how buildings flow from one to another. A lot of the standards like that are in here mimic those of a more historic structure. Not all of the historic structures maybe we want to, but there are, that's how we approached this. So I guess we'd have to get into, I would need to know more specifics of what exactly you're looking, what features you're looking to emulate or honor. Whenever we talk about character or context, it's really hard to define because it changes over time and it's very nebulous. And so I think there may be better tools than this for getting at that. And we can continue to have that conversation.
Okay, I think that's important. Thank you.
My name is Amy Samasco. I live on Bartlett Street, and I see a lot of my neighbors here. And the elephant in the room here is all of us are very concerned about what's going to happen in front of our houses. And we can see this, and the truth for, I think, many of us is how does it eventually affect us when someone goes to put one of these where we can see it? And I think it's all really good information, and I like that the city's paying attention to it. But when you look at the map online, I mean, we're afraid. We've been afraid because we know that we just got 2 giant buildings on Cabot Street, and it feels like we've had no say, and now there could be something very big happening. It might not be included in this, and that's fair, so where is it?
So nothing in these design standards dramatically changes what already exists in terms of capacity of building. So, as I said, we're intending, and the intention was to honor same or similar heights that are allowed, but it also adding things like the building floor plate, the footprint of the building, and it's actually smaller, what we're allowing, than what's being built right now. And then some of the requirements for breaking up a building, that's might be too big, or having greater setbacks than are previously currently allowed in the zoning. There's a number of features in here that I think actually will make for fewer buildings that feel like they take up the whole lot and that's all they take up. So I think that is one of the goals. Yep. There will be additional time for comments. You're welcome to go ahead now.
I'm Bill Finch at 50 Front Street in Beverly. Just for the record, I am chair of the Beverly Historic District Commission, but I am not speaking on behalf of the opinion of the commission. That's my own opinion. I have a few things in the weeds and a comment on the question of context in terms of historical or where things are. The design standards show that the lot that the railroad station is on and the whole parking lot there is tier, if I've got it right, I think it's tier 5. Maybe it's tier 4, I'm not sure, without seeing them, but that's a clear case of question of historical context versus what this would allow. It would seem to make sense that either there was a much shorter tier there or that it was not included at all, because I don't think any of us in the room want to see that railroad station encased by a 5-story building.
Yeah, and that parcel is currently not part of it because it's in the IR zone. So it was part of it. When we were talking about the Bass River rezoning, that parcel was included. So right now we're not proposing a change for that. But we do recognize that, and when we were talking about the Bass River zoning, we were talking about whether or not to include that parcel and how to treat that parcel.
I'm just saying it may not be a problem to have a 5-story building across the street, but it is a problem to have it right smack against it. Mm-hmm. Or for that matter, to tear it down and build one. I have a few, I was pleased to see the articulation of the first floor amenities in the standards and the definition of allowing some buildings to get set back up to 12 feet if they provide those. I think the one size fits all, everything must be 2 feet from the sidewalk, really doesn't work. So I think that's a very positive thing. A couple of little wrinkles in the half-story business. You make a clear distinction between a mansard roof and a sloped roof, saying a mansard roof counts as a full story. You don't talk about the situation where somebody has sloped roof on either side and a flat roof across, which is what happens when you start getting very deep buildings. I presume you would consider that to be a full story, but it isn't articulated.
Yeah, okay.
Otherwise, it seems to be a major loophole.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Does Tier 5 allow, in the stuff I read online, Tier 5 allowed 65 feet on Rantoul. Is that still the case or not?
No, we're going to go back and take another look at the heights because we've changed the heights, and we are not anticipating anything to be above 55 feet.
Yeah, okay. And I also think the provision for half stories, well, it's okay in Tier 2 and perhaps Tier 3, where that's a very typical, vernacular building technique. When you get into Tier 4 or 5, are places where you may have a very wide building, as in a 50 or 60 foot wide building with double loaded quarters. It's not appropriate to even consider it.
Yeah.
Let's see. Then I may be in error here, but the standards appear to require that in Tier 5, the top 2 floors, Floor 4 and Floor 5, are to be set back 7 feet from the facade line on both the principal and secondary streets. Am I correct in that?
I'd have to go back and
Okay.
look at
Anyway,
that one, but that's a note
Assume
your
it is,
comment.
assuming it is, we have, and I'm partially responsible for this because I was on the design review board that liked to do these setbacks. But when we look at some of the recent buildings on Rantoul Street and the setbacks that were done in accordance with the design review board and the standards we were talking about, they are not, in my opinion anyway, visually successful. They look like temporary buildings that have been plopped on top. It's more successful, frankly, when the facade rises straight up.
I've heard that before.
Yeah. 2 out of 3 of the buildings, I think, are not successful. One is, but let's see. Oh, another basic question. In terms of the provision where if there is a residential district abutting a tier district, that the height standards for the residential district apply regardless of the height for the tier. In other words, if a tier 4 is next to a residential district with a limit of 35 feet, then the tier 4 would be reduced to 35 feet. Now, does that mean that the residential district has to be literally contiguous, or is it across the street? That's a big difference.
We've interpreted it as literally adjacent or contiguous.
It has to be essentially right next door to it, not
touching
across
parcel,
the street.
Yeah, not across the street.
Okay. That should probably be clarified just so people understand it. Okay, I think that sort of covers it. I did, in reading the old waterfront, the existing waterfront development zoning, there is some language in there that does do lip service to historic preservation. Things like buildings shall be designed to the scale and character of the surrounding neighborhood, and shall incorporate design elements and create a blah, 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 attractive.
Yeah, and those are things that are really difficult to enforce. Those are really difficult to enforce, because what does that mean?
Oh, I know,
Right,
but
so
if
that's-
you don't say it, the developer may not even think about it. Anyway, thank you.
You got into the weeds, Bill. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Wendy Pearl. I'm also on the Historic Districts Commission, but I speak just as myself. Could you just clarify what the purpose of the minimum height requirement is? And in particular, I'm thinking if a building burns down and it was only a 1.5-story building, are the owners then compelled to build back bigger? Because it does sound very, like you said, rigid, and it is a requirement, and it seems like in all of these scenarios, a building could be no lower than 2.5 stories. And I think there are plenty of smaller buildings, and I'm just wondering if it compels an owner to build bigger when something smaller existed prior. Thank you.
Yep. I'm trying to remember why we went with the minimum stories. I think a little bit of it is for continuity in the districts and ensuring that there, is a streetscape. But that one I might have to get back to you on, Wendy, because I'm trying to recall back to last year as to why we went with the minimum. And I don't know if anybody else on the committee remembers, but yeah, I'll get back to you on that one. We will have time for comments later as well, and the things that I'm going to get into in the second half of the presentation are more in line with some of these questions about specifics about what the standards are, kind of a little bit about what Bill was talking about, and so don't leave. And what I'm going to ask everybody to do now is we have, how many boards do we have? I'd like you to meet Ken Clausen, our Assistant Planning Director. I also have Dylan Lukic, our Economic Planner for 1.5 more weeks, helping me out. But so 4 boards, we can try and spread out. We'll take about 10, 15 minutes. You you can do this, you don't have to do it. We'll also have the boards up after, if you want to do it again before you leave. Let me see, get that slide up again. So a blue pin is where you think it should be tier 5 stories. Red is tier 4, that's hard to read. Yellow is tier 3, and white is tier 2. So mill about for 10 minutes, we'll bring you back, and then we'll continue. start to get back to their seats. If you add them all together, I don't know.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you know.
Blue is 5, red is 4, yellow is 3, white is 2.
No stuff in the box.
Hey, just to let you know, anyway.
You can always come back and do more pins. Well, change your pins after. Nobody should be stuffing the boards with pins. All right, we're gonna get started again. As I said, this part is a little bit more getting into the weeds. I'm gonna let them finish. Starting to talk about some of the actual dimensional standards. You know, dimensional standards are height and footprint, and yes, we can take the boards down if it's easier to see. Setback. Those are the kind of more simpler ones. We've added some additional ones in these design standards that help talk about the environment, the building, and placement. And some of these apply to any tier, and some of them don't apply to all the tiers. I just want to go through the concepts. I don't want to get into all of the dimensional standards of all of the tiers, but I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody if you want to go through that. I don't think this is the right place, so I want to highlight some of the key concepts. So street hierarchy, as I mentioned, primary streets and secondary streets were introduced. So that relates to, for example, Rantoul Street and Cabot Street would be primary streets, Thorndike Street here, Abbott Street, secondary streets. And that helps to reinforce the walkable nature of these two important downtown streets, and allow that and require that certain things happen on those streets that maybe wouldn't need to be or wouldn't be appropriate on a secondary street. So it relates to concepts that I'll introduce: the build-to zone, the facade build-out, parking setbacks and where parking should be located. Again, permitted ground story uses. We currently have language for that on Rantoul and Cabot, which we call our core pedestrian area. And we've kept that similar language about active ground floor uses. But I will have a caveat about that. The MBTA Communities Act, which some people may be familiar with or may not, requires every community that has transit access. I wasn't going to bring this up. I don't know why I did. But here I am going down the rabbit hole of every community that has some level of transit access having to provide, have zoning that would allow for a certain level of density, 15 units per acre, around, in an area designated around their transit center. We are still working on what we need to change for that. One of my issues with that zoning, that law, is that it doesn't allow you to require ground floor retail. So there may be some areas in the community where we would not be able to require ground floor active uses. And so that's something I'm still trying to figure out, but it's in here. We did this last year. You know, it's our intent and our belief that, one, the city of Beverly can accommodate that from a development perspective and ask that of our developers and still have development, and two, that it's really important for that area of downtown to have ground floor uses that are active uses. And they don't always have to be commercial uses. We do allow for some level of residential, lobby, gym type of like uses, as long as there's transparency between the use and the street, so that when you're walking by, you're not just walking by a blank wall. And then the other one is permitted frontage types. I'll get into that too. So the build to zone, this is a new concept that we don't currently have. It's an area where we have a minimum and a maximum front setback, which I showed you a little bit before. I think it's minimum 4, maximum 12. That gives a little bit of flexibility for a building to be placed on a lot. You know, we've had a lot of pushback about buildings being right on the back of the sidewalk, and you'll see later why this allows for flexibility. Then facade build out. This is the ratio of the width of the building to the lot width. Again, not a standard that we have throughout our entire zoning ordinance right now. We do have it, something similar in the core pedestrian area. So it requires that a building be built to a percentage of the lot, which means it's not going to be built to the full lot, which allows for driveways, other things on the side. And it also makes it so that you could meet that standard with 2 buildings. So you don't always have to have 1 building on the lot. So frontage area is the area between the building facade, the front wall of the building, and any front lot line. So essentially it also correlates to that build to zone. And in that frontage area, that we have a new concept called frontage types. And all of these apply to what you would know as the CC district, or the tier 4, the tier 5. A couple of them, and also they're not all shown here, but there's an entry plaza, dining patio, gallery, arcade, front garden, dooryard, which is like a residential door front yard, stoop, and porch. So dooryard, stoop, and porch apply to the secondary streets, particularly in tier 4 and tier 5, where that's more appropriate use on the side streets, but on the front, in the main primary streets, we want to have active uses. But what this new standard or concept allows, it allows us to have, in new buildings, patio dining, or areas in, I guess an example would be Canvas that has what would be considered a gallery. Yeah, it is Canvas, the old Ford building. So there's a covering and a walkway, and some of the restaurants have a patio area underneath that. So if you think about that concept, that's kind of what this frontage type allows, and it allows for flexibility in that a building owner could pick and choose from which type of use they want to have there. But it also promotes an active streetscape. I started talking about ground story active uses, so don't necessarily need to get into this a little bit anymore, but this just shows how, in 480 Rantoul, we do have some those are essentially dooryards. And on a primary street, under these new design standards, they wouldn't be allowed there. And then on the other side, the other side of the building, they have active uses in a gym and amenities, so maybe it's more appropriate for those uses to be on the front of the building. So we have ground story articulation, which was in our core pedestrian area definition currently and referred to in the formerly tall building overlay design guidelines. But the importance of this is that it differentiates the ground floor from the upper stories with the horizontal band, or some other change in material or change in window size, or all of the above. to create a distinct base, and just both creates a more attractive environment and a more attractive building. And a little bit about just a visual of helping to understand building height and how it's calculated in the city of Beverly. Not a new concept, building height, for sure, but it is either the average grade of the footprint of the building or the average grade at the front of the building to the top of the highest roof beam. And then I think Bill talked a little bit about half stories and some questions he had with that. But it is a full half story that's counted would be a habitable space under a pitched roof. And as he mentioned, there are some areas where half stories are more appropriate and pitched roofs specifically are more appropriate than others. And the tier 2 and the tier 3 have height maximums of 2.5 and 3.5 stories in order to accommodate for that. And depending on the type of roof and the size of the roof, it may be counted as a half story or not. Parking standards also are not new, but there are some new nuances to this, in that there are requirements that parking be placed behind buildings where possible, that it encourages the shared use of lots so that if there's two properties next to each other and you can circulate through the parking lot without having to come back onto the main street, that would be encouraged. That parking lot access, unless absolutely impossible, is preferred not to come from the main primary street. That will help with traffic flow and direction, and also help with pedestrian traffic, so people are not having to cross frequent driveways and streets. There are additional setbacks for parking standards. Also a requirement for screening when abutting R districts, which exists now. But maintaining that are the lower scale residential districts. A new standard for a planting strip required to separate the public right-of-way from a primary street. This also includes specific landscaping standards for depth of the landscaping bed, and requirements or preferences to using low-impact design and improved stormwater management tools. This is both a visual standard, but also an environmental standard that helps promote stormwater management, having less paved area in the downtown to help absorb rainwater and runoff. And then the final one was that when there's a driveway curb cut, the sidewalk is the primary goal. So the sidewalk has to run across the driveway rather than it being a driveway. So that gives preference to the pedestrians. Probably sounds really simple, but it doesn't happen in practice very often. So this is a repeat of the slide I showed before. These dimensional standards for the lot and for the buildings would essentially replace the standards that exist now in these districts, and supersede or be in addition to. I did not edit this slide, so these were the heights we had before. And there's a lot about height that I think we still have to work out. Whether or not we need to have the floor-to-floor heights, or those need to be changed if we're changing and lowering the height of the buildings overall. So these are kind of the real detail things. Then additional standards, some of these I've talked about, some I haven't, but so in addition to those dimensional standards, we've got the architectural standards that talk about the building, mainly the facade and the sides and how it should look and how people access it and what it feels like to a pedestrian walking by. Parking and loading standards, which I just kind of went through all those details, summarizing that parking, when it exists, should really be secondary to the building and be hidden to the extent possible. And then other site improvements in landscaping, like screening requirements, fences and walls, and the landscape standards that I discussed. The design standards also include a lot of definitions, a lot of terms, and those are all defined. Some terms are new, and some terms are our existing terms, and we've kept the definitions that exist for the most part. There may have been a couple that we changed, but generally we deferred to what our existing definitions were rather than changing them. And that is the end of my presentation. So I can happy to do more questions, get into a little bit more specifics. Got a little time, we have a little time. I can show some of those building examples if people want, but first I want to open it up for questions. And again, if there's the comment box, if you don't want to speak in public, you can also email me. But if you are going to make a comment, if you could come to the podium. And I'll wait.
I will make a comment.
All right.
My name is John Willett. I am the chair of the Design Review Board, and I want to first thank you to Darlene tonight for the presentation. But I've worked in a lot of cities in my career, and as the mayor said, almost all of them have design standards very similar to what we're seeing tonight. Both as a private citizen here and as the chair of the DRB, I kind of will speak for both. But as a DRB member, as chair, it's very important that we adopt high standards for this city, and we are able to, when we work with developers and review drawings, that we are able to hold those drawings and those sites to our standards, which are being developed. So right now, we are in a situation where we would like to set conditions on a plan, but we have there's nothing enforcing that. And what we're asking for in this process with standards is some enforcement, and that will help the review process that we do in the DRB. I also think that we need to hold developers to a very high standard, and standards will help us do that. It would be helpful that we get these standards in place and we build on them. This is a very good baseline, but we build on them for the future, and it includes, as Darlene has mentioned, better landscape standards, so that our trees along Cabot that are not doing very well actually do better. So there's lots of things like that I can get to, and as landscape architect, I'll spare you that as a landscape architect, but I'm happy to answer any questions since I'm here.
You can't tell me that you don't have any more questions.
I just have one thing to say, and that's, this is great. It's great to see this finally. I've been here 40 years, believe it or not. And someone once stood up and said, you can't say anything in a Beverly meeting for 30 years. But I just want to thank you for all the work that went into this, because I'm sure it represents a tremendous amount of hours and meetings and planning, and I didn't have to be the person that just spoke, but I want to hold these developers to the highest standard we can.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Mindy DiPolito, Odell Avenue. I found these documents, a presentation, very clear and understandable for somebody who has no background in, planning or architecture or anything. So I appreciate that. I found it very user-friendly. I was wondering, you had mentioned verbally a few times that what had been a change from what exists or doesn't exist to this proposal, and I was wondering if there was some thing that existed, like a side-by-side, to show what is the difference between now and the change versus what is staying the same.
Yeah.
I get that could be very confusing if that's
Yeah, so
website, what is new, what is old, but some of what you said, I know what is changing, and then some I'm not sure what. Yeah, what is new.
It's a great question. There are probably two ways to do that. So one is, this is a really nice document. It doesn't look anything like what our zoning ordinance looks like, and one thing that I have to do is take this nice document and turn it into our wordy, little boring zoning ordinance, right, some way. And when I do that, I'll redline it so that there'll be a redline copy. But I'm still thinking about it, but I'm kind of hoping to be able to just keep this document as a attachment in some way, right? So as an appendix to the zoning ordinance in its form. But to go into the zoning ordinance, I have to take the pieces out and kind of put them in the way our zoning ordinance is structured more by district than how this document looks. But then the other way, there's probably a simpler and easy, like a quicker way we can do it, where we just do a comparison of terms, right? What terms we've added and terms that we've kept the same. We haven't done that, but that's something we can.
I was just
probably
curious. Like,
At the time of submission, we usually always do a red line for the council and the planning board to look at when we do a submission. This one is definitely going to be messier, but hopefully we can pull it off.
and this is so much nicer to look at.
Right, I know.
Okay.
It's much
Yeah.
easier to
Thank
use.
you.
Yeah.
Marilyn McCrory, Lovett Court. Darlene, thank you. It's a very interesting presentation and concept. You mentioned that there will be open space requirements in some districts, and I just would hope, I'd be interested in learning more about why just some districts. I would encourage you to think about allowing green spots, little oases within, especially the dense areas of downtown. It's really important for community character and just for quality of life.
Yeah, I think maybe there are not open space requirements currently in every district, but the tiers all have a 15% or a 10% minimum open space requirement. And these only relate to the CC and the CN, which are more, right now, parcels that generally could get built out lot width, or lot side, I can't even talk, to the entire lot. So it would be adding that, like in the downtown, in the CC district, it would be adding a 15% open space requirement.
Hi, I'm Diane Shirk, and I'm really encouraged to kind of build off of what you just talked about with the open spaces. I think that there's a long way that that we can go to make the pedestrian experience better for people, especially on Rantoul. We lived there for a year, and the poor little Odell Park is truly every single dog on Rantoul Street goes to the bathroom there because there's nowhere else to go. So, things like, some open space, green space, people take good care of it. They pick up after their dogs, but still, it's just such a densely populated area and, more apartments going in. So making Rantoul especially, more pedestrian friendly, greening the sidewalk. I mean, I'm encouraged about the strip between the sidewalk and the primary road, again, for stormwater drainage, but also this is the Garden City, and we are lacking some green and flowers and open spaces for people to have some respite.
Again, Wendy Pearl again. So you mentioned the additional considerations, which I hadn't really paid attention to in the document. And this is where some of the stuff that like Bill and Caroline had mentioned before about some kind of control for historic areas. And I just wondered if the additional consideration talks about considering design standard exemptions for adaptive reuse of existing buildings, increased setbacks when abutting historic districts, and allowances for non-conforming renovations. Where does that fit into your process? So you said you're going to take these standards and make them into a zoning ordinance. So are these things going to be decided on separately, or can we say tonight we want those things and you'll write them in? Because they seem to not be part of what you presented, but they're in the document. So I don't understand where they fit in the process.
I didn't present everything that's in the document. Yeah. So, but I'm at this phase, I am in accepting feedback and comments and making edits to the standards as necessary before. I want to make any, I don't actually have an editable version, but I want to make any edits that are necessary or sought after in the design standards document before I go through the step of putting it into the zoning. So like this is the collection period, the kind of vetting period with the public, with the ideal hope that we can submit something to council that has been vetted and is largely, has a lot of community support and buy-in, so we don't have to make changes after that, as many changes after that potential. So it's kind of getting all that public process out now. And so I'm welcoming, changes and recommendations. Just because something wasn't presented tonight and it's in the document, doesn't mean that it's not going to stay in the document. So.
Okay. Well, I want to be on record as saying, I think that adopting some of those tools would be really helpful, especially design standard exemptions for adaptive reuse, because that will incentivize adaptive reuse. And think about Depot 2, there was an adaptive reuse component of that project, which I think a lot of people feel like it made a much more successful kind of fit to the neighborhood, despite it being very, very large, and increased setbacks when abutting a historic district. Or even a historic property. We could use our National Register listing to determine where those things are. So I just think when there's a tool readily available to address some of the comments you've heard tonight, I would encourage you to just build it in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Scott Hausman, City Councilor, Ward 4. I would just like to underline and agree with the comments by Wendy Pearl about adaptive reuse and the importance of trying to incorporate, incorporating these kinds of features into part of the design standards. I know you said this does not deal with Cabot Street, but it does deal with the CC2 district, which is the core pedestrian area, which almost by definition is sort of a primary section of Cabot Street, which is unique in its characteristics of having close to 40 historic buildings in the city. It's one of the two historic districts in the city, and is very unique in that respect, which I think relates to what we talk about, the amorphous sense of the feel of that section of Cabot Street. So again, I would just underline, I think, the importance of trying to incorporate those into adaptive reuse aspects of the building standards.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I didn't mean to say that it doesn't address Cabot Street, but that it doesn't treat one street different from another, aside from the fact that they are different zones now. But it originally, when what I meant to say was it creates a template for standards that would be applied based on what tier you're in, not necessarily what street it is. But I welcome your comment about adding in those other factors.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Pam Gugian with the ZBA. I apologize, I came in late and maybe you covered this, but what do you predict for the future with this in terms of a timeline of how long the process is going to take and before it gets to implementation?
Thanks I actually don't think I think I meant to cover that. We have talked about, there's a bit of work to take this and turn it into what would be submitted as a zoning ordinance. Ideally, we wanted to have it done this session with council, but knowing that, council hits June and they're in budget meetings, I think the last time we were before the council, actually maybe that was just the legal affairs meeting, I mentioned that more likely we would be primed to submit a formal zoning amendment in the request for a zoning amendment when council starts up again in the fall, from a timing perspective. And in the meantime, address comments, collect feedback, finish that piece of it, and then turn it from this nice, easily legible document into a zoning ordinance, and hopefully keep both, so that it can become a zoning ordinance update that can be filed with council. So, I think that covers it.
So an official date for enforcement would take place probably sometime after the fall, you think?
Yeah, generally, when we submit an ordinance amendment to council, there's a public hearing with the planning board, and then the planning board makes a recommendation and brings it back to city council. You know, as I said, hopefully we're having most of the process around this one now versus having it after it enters council, so it could be done in a couple of months and then forwarded to general code for adoption late fall, for implementation late fall.
Oh, thanks.
Hi, Danielle Spang from 16 Mulberry Street. I'm talking in my personal capacity. For the open space that it would add, those requirements, would that be guaranteed public access to the open space, or it could be limited to residents of the building or development?
I'd have to look at what we wrote, but I imagine that would be more like most likely private open space, but just having green and, you know, green area both for aesthetic purposes, for use, and for environmental purposes on a lot. Anyone else? Okay. Hearing none. As I said, I'm accepting comments by email. My email is dwynne@beverlyma.gov for anybody watching online or who feels more comfortable that way. Also open to walking through it in more detail with people. I can be reached at 978-605-2341. And I thank you all for coming. Feel free to change your pin, or, you know, add your pin if you didn't get to, but don't add pins if you already did. You know, I appreciate all of you coming out and listening. Thank you.